I'm sure you've heard the term decolonize these days. Decolonize the school curriculum, decolonize the workplace, or even decolonizing the countryside. As this article discusses, reimagining who the countryside is for. It states because of colonial hangovers, the traditional image of the countryside has often been one of homogeneity, with little representation of black and brown communities. And it goes on to saying that this is just a bad thing. So in summary, the countryside is full of white people, and that is a problem. And it concludes by saying why we need to engage with the history of rural spaces in order to reclaim them. And I'm not really sure what it means by reclaiming them. Reclaiming from who? Reclaiming from the people who actually live there? Reclaiming them for people who have no ties to the land whatsoever? And maybe if the demographics of the countryside look more like London, then maybe the countryside will be culturally enriched and made much better. Now, all of this is an attempt to undermine the indigenous people of the UK and other European countries, to subvert institutions and deconstruct the foundations of Western civilization. But when I was looking into this in detail, I was thinking about what happened to countries, particularly in Africa, after European colonial empires withdrew their presence to allow these nations to rule themselves. And in doing so, I came across this absolutely mental documentary made by some Italians in the 1960s. Now keep that in mind that these are Italians, because being Italian is going to save their lives during this documentary. Now before I go in, I do have some issues with the messaging of the narrator, which I will cover, but the documentary shows the absolute insanity of the state of Africa following the European powers leaving. Now this documentary was made 60 years ago, and it's good to see now that Africa is a paradise that welcomes everyone. Now, the documentary is brutal and it's hard to watch in many parts, but I will go over a brief summary of it and use it as a case study to see just how successful decolonizing actually was. So let's kick things off with Kenya. How did things go following their independence being achieved?
In Kenya, it's urgently needed. The young nation's first independent elections have been scheduled, and excitement has reached a fever pitch.
Now here we see them practicing some crowd control techniques that I'm sure will only need to be used in absolute extreme circumstances.
During this campaign, irresponsible politicians promised to hand over all the whites' property, houses, cars, lands, and livestock, unprepared for modern democracy but eager to claim their shares. As if they could buy them with their votes, Africans scramble to the polls, but all they get is an age-old lesson meted out with the same old clubs, landing on the same old heads.
So as soon as they have some form of democracy, the indigenous Africans standing for election, they immediately promise to hand over the land, the property, the wealth, and everything that belongs to the white people that have settled there. Now across the continent, whether it was the British, the Dutch, the Belgians, wherever they were, they essentially just sold up and moved, or whatever wasn't forcibly taken from them was left to the African population. So now that it's in the hands of its new owners, what do you think actually became of this land?
Empty and silent, the old farms await new masters. Kenyatta wanted to hurt the pride of the upper-class English colonials. Only the pioneers of the highlands were chased out. The whites living on the plains are left alone.
I'm not a farmer myself, but is this not completely stripping away the topsoil, which is the most nutrient part of the land?
December 27, 1963, 2 weeks after independence, Kenya begins its agrarian reform.
So this is something I don't really get. There's plenty of arable farmland that's been used by the colonizers for generations. Why are they digging up the front gardens and using that as land to farm? Why are they dynamiting trees?
A poem by Kano Toynbee, an African, comes to mind. Erase every trace of the white man. Uproot the tree of his evil. plow under his flower gardens, make them bear fruits. There where only one lived, we will make room for 100.
Erase every trace of the white man, uproot his tree of evil. Now, where have I heard this before? Now, I'm sure this stark comparison of what we witness in European countries and the United States, it is in no way foreshadowing anything for our future. So they wanted it because it wasn't theirs, and the consequence of them taking it over, well, it's exactly what you expect.
In Kenya, the highlands are a rare oasis of green. Under the British, they were a private white estate. From outside, the Africans admired it and desired it. Now they claim it. Before, when only 150 whites lived here, it was too much for too few. But now 10,000 Africans want in. Now it's too little for too many.
Wow, who could have predicted that? I mean, look at this guy. There's plenty of trees all around him, but instead he's tearing up the seat that he is sitting on himself and chopping it down with a machete. He just doesn't give a fuck though, does he? So now that Africa is being ruled by the Africans, what sort of message or education does this new government from this new Africa wish to promote?
Africa's free, but still black. Whites made Africa ashamed to be black. Some call blacks the devil's creation. Now, to wipe away that shame, the new Africa creates its own racism, and the devil changes his color. These lessons are taught by government teachers.
This is one of the themes I don't like from this documentary that I'll just clarify now. The documentary implies that racism was a product of the white man that was brought into Africa. To me, this logic suggests that it's the fault of the Europeans that 800,000 Tutsis were slaughtered by the Hutus in Rwanda in 1994. It's suggesting that without this imported racism from the white man, this would have never happened. Even the new Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch, I'm not sure, a Nigerian woman of Yoruba ethnicity, which is one of the many ethnicities in Nigeria. She stated recently that Yoruba name my true identity, and I refuse to be lumped with the northern people of Nigeria. We be our ethnic enemies. So did this ethnic tension only exist because Europeans exported racism to Africa? And of course not. And you might stop to think as well, did she really say it in this way? Am I just being stereotypical to suggest this is how she sounds? Well, when trying to find this specific quote, I came across BBC Pidgin, which I'd never heard of. And apparently, there is a whole BBC site, which I remind you is a UK taxpayer-funded organisation that is dedicated to writing news in a way so West Africans who may not grasp English language fully and they speak in eubonic gibberish, they can understand the propaganda that's been served to them. But anyways, back to the race realism.
The white brain is smaller than the black brain. The white man knows this and is afraid. In America, blacks invented the biggest of all bombs, but they are still kept in big glass prisons, like slaves. Hannibal was the white man's master. He gave him the signs used for writing. Hannibal also gave him the wheel, which Hannibal had invented. But when he brought it to the white king, the king killed him and ate him. Because they want to become black, whites lie in the sun by the sea. The white woman is descended from the monkey, and her hair is as straight as a monkey's.
Now, Hannibal was not black, and a quick reminder that the demographics of North Africa, i.e. anything above the Sahara Desert, was very different 2,000 years ago. And this topic is a whole video in itself, so let me know if you want this covered more in detail. But the reality is, before Europeans, in sub-Saharan Africa, there was no written language, no two-story buildings, no calendar, and certainly no wheel. But just on this topic, I'm going to lay out my opinion on this now. Within conservative circles, you hear a lot of people say that the British Empire in particular was a benefit for Africa. They'll tout things by saying, look at what we gave them, all of this technology, all of this medicine, all of this infrastructure. We've allowed them to develop faster, and these countries are better off because of what we left them. But I personally do not agree with this. Yes, these countries were undeveloped, extremely tribal, and arguably savage and barbaric, but this was their state of nature. Now look at these guys. They have perfect circadian rhythm. They're probably the happiest people on the planet. They eat what they can find and they live a subsistence life. Just look how healthy they are. I think giving them the ability to destroy themselves with technology and industry is not a good thing. It's like giving a toddler a handgun. They're just not ready for this responsibility. They've lived for hundreds of thousands of years like this. Giving them all this technology within the space of a generation, how could you expect it to end up any other way other than a complete mess? But progressive liberals lie to themselves by saying that we're all the same, and so it's just a matter of culture that needs to change, and then things will become better. But for me, it's much deeper than culture, but that's a topic for another day as well. Now, during the decolonization, it wasn't just Western countries. A lot of East Africa was dominated by the Arabs. And just like the Belgians in Congo, the Arab colonization was particularly brutal when it came to the slave trade. It's partly why there's not many Africans descended from slaves living in the Arab countries. A lot of them, once imported, were simply castrated, so they weren't able to actually breed. They lived like eunuchs.
Just as in Zanzibar, the ancient African hatred of Arabs is broken loose. Muslim blood flows freely everywhere, but especially in Bagamoyo, the port where long ago the Arabs used to round up the slaves before loading them onto slave ships. Already the mortuaries are full, and the cadavers overflow into the sun. Patiently, the vultures wait for the inspection to finish, so that they can begin their own.
Now this is the part where the documentary gets absolutely mental. Essentially, there's a huge race riot where the Africans are kicking out all the Muslims and Arabs. But these Italians are just driving around trying to get a good shot of what's going on. But they seem to have no self-preservation or have a real sense of the danger they're actually in here.
President Nairi has gone into hiding, the police have disappeared, and mutinous army troops have taken over the city, but they make no effort to control the rioting crowds. Dar es Salaam has toppled into anarchy. For us, it is almost suicidal to travel through the streets. We are chased away, threatened and insulted. We try to reach the Arab quarter, but everywhere crowds hide from our cameras the bloody evidence of the massacre. On Ocean Road, a Muslim tries to escape a crowd of Africans by running out into the sea. When the crowd overtakes him, he is drowned. The Africans feel that the Arabs now exploit them as pitilessly as the whites used to. Because of this, they demolish Arab shops and houses.
Now, because of the exploitation of the Arabs and the Western colonizers, there's arguably a justified hatred for these people from the Africans, so it's not surprising that everything's been torn down. Now, what we witness today is the same blood libel, the same resentment, the same anger that bubbles under the surface and lashes out every 10 years or so across cities in the West. Do you think these race riots are going to get better, or do you think they're going to get worse? This is when it gets really dumb. They're literally walking into a firing squad and they're just driving up with their stupid little car, and they just think they can get away with it. And the African rebels are rightfully pissed off and want them to fuck off.
Dozens of Arabs have put to the wall. Someone has killed 3 mutineers, so now there must be a reprisal. But we're not welcome at the executions. They scream at us and threaten us with machine guns. When we stall to get some good shots, one of the soldiers loses his temper.
However, the Italians have a special card to play in situations just like this.
One of us is cut by the flying glass, but there's no question of treatment. The mutineers jerk us out of our car and haul us to the wall. They're about to execute us when a rebel officer sees one of our passports and shouts, "Wait! These aren't whites. They're Italians."
Now, the age-old debate, are Italians white? I would always argue yes. However, this documentary has made me think otherwise. This African soldier was so sure that these were whites and they're about to line them against the wall and shoot them in the back of the head. But as soon as he sees that they're Italians, he just lets them go. So there we have it.
Entire villages burn. The Arabs machine gunned. Trucks loaded with Arab corpses, carting them off to mass graves. Politicians call such scenes embarrassing.
Now, that would be somewhat embarrassing. I imagine Keir Starmer next month, after some sort of race riot where, let's say, let's pick a random faction. Let's say the Sikhs. Let's say they piss somebody off, and all of a sudden there's mass graves full of Sikhs. That would be kind of embarrassing, wouldn't it? I would be embarrassed if I was the Prime Minister. I'm rather embarrassed that there's mass graves with a particular ethnic group piling up. This is rather embarrassing.
And so they are. To the old colonialists who created their own racism and allowed other racisms to fester, then abandoned Africa to those merciless passions. To the new rulers who are creating new racisms, and to the new exploiters east and west who spread false promises so they can increase their own profits or power.
Again, this is the stupid context of this narrator. Created their own racism. So again, the white man invented racism. They then left Africa, but the racism remains, and now the Africans use this racism to commit ethnic genocide. I mean, did ethnic tensions not exist in Africa prior to the colonial empires?
The Arab leaders have escaped to the mainland with the Sultan. These are Zanzibar's poor Arabs, thousands and thousands, petty shopkeepers and small landowners. Now, as always, the poor and the innocent will pay for the sins of their ancestors, who 150 years ago turned Zanzibar into the cruelest slave market the world ever saw, and for the crimes of their leaders, who try to continue in modern times that ancient oppression. Ancient Muslim cemeteries turned into modern extermination camps, women and children trembling under the muzzles of the rebels' guns. And one of the most pitiful scenes in history's brutal anthology of death. Thousands of Arabs fleeing into the sea. A desperate race to an impossible salvation. Then, the next day.
I mean, this is something you probably didn't learn in school. After the colonial empires left Africa, where you taught that African rebel groups would chase the Arabs into the sea. So now let's focus back on the Western colonial empires. What sort of things happened to them throughout the departure of their standing as the ruling force?
Have you anything to say? Prioress?
You. When the accused was arrested, we found these. In his chamber. 4 rifles, a panga, and a pistol. They were made by his associates and himself for the crimes admitted to.
Mshtakiwa, waitambua bunduki hii?
Armed with this gun, exhibit number 4, together with 6 of his accomplices, Rashidi Singida, on the night of April the 6th, 1961, entered the farm of the British subject John Fletcher at Aberdare Point and strangled the askari on duty, Josephine Nataeli. The second victim of the accused was Miss Elizabeth Regan, sister-in-law of the farm owner, who was killed by Singida by means of a gun shot through the window. Alerted by the shot, Mr. Fletcher ran to the outside stairs and was wounded. Mr. Fletcher crawled into the house to protect his wife and 2 daughters. The accused and his associates rushed into the living room and finished with their panga knives Mr. Fletcher, his wife and 2 daughters, 18 and 15 years of age, who had looked for shelter under the table. The corpses of the 3 women were found without heads or limbs, while on Mr. Fletcher's body, a former naval officer, 72 panga blows were spotted.
Now this is pretty brutal, but this was, as I said, about 60 years ago now. I'm sure times have changed, and the mentality of killing the farmer, killing the boer, I'm sure that's over. I'm sure we can move past all that now, right?
Shoot to kill! Come on, sir! Kill the boer! The farmer! Kill farmer. Brr, pa, pa, brr, pa. Attention.
In February, armed robbers stormed this farmhouse and opened fire. Estelle Nieuwenhuizen's partner was shot repeatedly at close range.
I was shot 2 times there. One there, one here, and the other one went in here. And it went out of the back of my neck.
The attackers tried to take one final shot at Beres Henrico's head, but the rifle jammed.
And then I started getting Facebook messages and WhatsApp messages telling me that from different people that how sorry they are to hear about everything that happened. And so I started to panic, and I called my aunt back, and she told me just my 2 grandparents are murdered. And so I came here, and when I got here they told me my parents as well. So
Kill the boer, the farmer. Brr, pa, pa.
And I found them lying there, tied together, next to each other.
Right here, tied together?
Yeah, they were tied. My dad was lying on his back. My mother was lying face down, hands tied behind her back. My dad had a big gaping hole like the size of a golf ball in his throat. There was a pool of blood here all over. When I touched him, he was cold already. My mother was lying face down, but she was still hot. But I couldn't feel a pulse.
Well, anyways, let's move on to another topic that you may not have considered following the decolonization of Africa. One of the things the colonial empires created was the national parks of huge swaths of land containing all the, the precious wildlife that Africa holds.
Uhuru comes late to the White Highlands, where for over 60 years only whites were permitted to own land, where Kenya's richest farms lie. Here, settlers transform the rough African bush into a little piece of England.
And here we have, the British, they are employing what some may regard as an evil practice, using dogs to chase down a poor little fox. And personally, I don't have much to say on hunting. I believe that if it's just a fox, it's not as if they're killing millions and millions of them. It's more of a traditional thing that they do. I don't really have much to say on it. It is what it is. I don't really care. But there's plenty of people who despise hunting, who despise any sort of animal cruelty for no reason. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But it needs to be reiterated that these national parks to protect wildlife were created by the colonial empires. Now, following the colonial empires leaving, what do you think became of these national parks? How do you think the Africans treated the sacred lands?
The Africans don't have airplanes or powerful rifles, but they've got their ancient know-how and their numbers. So they gang up 10,000 strong, surround an area almost as big as Rhode Island, then pull the noose tight.
Now, this is where I'm glad the quality of this documentary is quite poor in terms of, it's not HD, it's probably barely 480p. Because a lot of the documentary is literally minutes upon minutes of animals being executed. Rhinos, hippos, elephants just being blown up. And I'm not being hyperbolic here, it is brutal to watch. I'm not going to show any of that. But just consider what the narrator said here. You've got 10,000 people in a huge circle covering an area of Rhode Island, and all they do is close in, killing every single thing in sight. Even though they weren't the ruling party anymore, there was still lots of private groups funding the protection of these animals because they knew that if they were left in the hands of the new Africa, they would be slaughtered and we would never see these animals ever again.
In an old abandoned farmhouse along the Zambezi River, isolated and lonely, are the headquarters of the Wildlife Society. Financed mostly by private English funds using radios and airplanes, the Society tries to keep informed on animal movements across a huge section of the continent. Its goal, to rescue as many animals as possible from poacher-infested areas and move them to better protected parks.
And again, if you want to see just how horrendous it is, you can watch the whole documentary. But honestly, as someone who can watch live leak videos, I can watch, industrial accidents of people being crushed in foundries or car accidents. For some reason, I can get over that quite easily. But watching minutes and minutes of elephants being executed, that's something I just can't do.
In the last 6 months alone, poachers have killed over 20,000 crocodiles here. The Wildlife Society can't possibly compete. This operation will save only 82. These lucky ones are knocked out with huge injections of tranquilizer serum. When they wake up, they'll be 250 miles away and safe for the moment. But since even most tourists don't get to Africa, we'd like to offer our own snapshot of the famous animal sanctuaries. This is edition 1964, Slaughter Paradise #1, the richest meat market in the world. Don't worry, down there in the water, a few hippos are still left for next Friday. Man, the most destructive of animals, has already passed this way. You can follow his trail for miles and miles, right across the heart of Africa, an endless panorama of desolation and death.
Man, the most destructive of animals. Now, I guess he's not wrong in saying that given the devastation created by man. He'd like to specify the type of man that created this mess. Was it not man that saved all these animals in these huge sanctuaries and enclosures? And then man decided to kill them all? Was there any difference between these type of men? Now let's cut to another documentary. I think it's called Country of Ashes. I'll share both in the description. I don't have them to hand right now. This is essentially a more modern documentary of like a Chinese company that is essentially doing its own form of colonization of Africa, where the deal is they build Africa, these huge infrastructure projects like dams, roads. In exchange, they essentially get to take all the resources because the Africans won't be able to pay it back. So they just do this in a way to essentially get resources. This exchange is just absolutely brilliant as it highlights the Chinese perspective of Africa, the colonial retreat in the mid-20th century, 60 years later, and this is their perspective of the country that they are trying to help. Eddie, is that railway line kaput? Unbelievable. You can't imagine the effort it took to build it. The infrastructure has gone to waste, it hurts to see it. The government here isn't efficient. We've been negotiating with them since the new year. Half a year of talking without any results. You were governed by a European country for so long. You should have learned how things work. It wasn't that long ago, only 50 years. We celebrated independence just a few weeks ago. Up until then, you were ruled by colonial rule. Experience should be passed on. Only that way you can develop. You went backwards, not forwards. You neglected the things others had left you. What's more, you completely destroyed them. It will take generations to put things right. If I have money, I drink all night. No matter if I'm broke in the morning, I'll drink water. It's like that here. Let's pivot to another topic the documentary covers, and that is South Africa.
We leave the animal sanctuaries to enter another sanctuary, South Africa, the sanctuary of the whites. The break seems sharp and clean. Here, order and luxury. Back there, turmoil and hunger. South Africa's whites claim that the break is absolute. To the cry of Africa for the Africans, the whites respond, this isn't Africa. And the change is so abrupt, the country so prosperous that this could almost seem true. When the whites first arrived in Cape Town, they found relatively few blacks. Now the blacks outnumber them 4-1. Now the blacks say, this is Africa, their Africa, which the whites have taken from them, which they want back.
Now this is something to really consider. South Africa had literally a population of 0. There was no migration into what is now South Africa, or a select few groups. But the settlers that came to South Africa, they came to a land that was unsettled, completely hostile, and within a few generations they created a civilization from scratch. That's not the same as turning up to an already established civilization and then claiming benefits.
But in Africa, life explodes as powerfully as death. Here in South Africa, for every white baby, 5 blacks are born. Frightened, the whites have set up a system of complete racial segregation, apartheid. In their castle in the sky, they claim it can work. But in reality, it's an impossible, hysterical defense. And the longer it endures, the more it threatens to change the joyous smiles of the new generations into the grim lines of hate.
So the narrator tries to state that apartheid is just a false dream, that it can't possibly work. But the South Africa that he's talking about in the 1960s was working. It wasn't established, it was functional, it was extremely prosperous. So I'm not really sure what angle he's getting at, that if apartheid was to end, Africa would be much, much better. And now we have the hindsight to see what happened after apartheid. Now you tell me which South Africa looks better, pre or post apartheid.
This is what the Rainbow Nation has become. Never in my life did I think I'd ever see this. This is the start of the road. Hang on, it gets worse. Believe it or not. Check this. Check this. Check this. Check this. This is Connaught Bridge that goes from Old North Coast Road to Umgani Road. Check this. Check this. Check this. Check this. Check this. And there's some people still dumping more shade. And he thinks he's funny.
In the past days, looting has spread from stores to factories and warehouses, ransacking and rioting in South Africa's worst violence since apartheid. From the eastern provinces of KwaZulu-Natal to Johannesburg's economic hub.
All of the doors are open. People are walking in.
Highways on fire, skies full of smoke. The police hopelessly outnumbered. Protests started with the jailing of former South African President Jacob Zuma last Wednesday, accused of corruption. His supporters see his treatment as a symbol of the current government's repression. If they release Zuma, he says, we would be free. Until then, we keep protesting. But over the weekend, this spark ignited frustration with years of economic hardship, unemployment at 32%, and months of pandemic restrictions. And now, the prospect of food shortages and hunger.
This is very painful, and I don't know what can I say about that. This is not our fault. I don't know what happened to the government. We don't know.
Don't waste your ammo.
Stop. Okay, let's go.
More than a third of the world's diamonds come out of this earth. In South Africa, the white man is rich in diamonds, but poor in foresight. This wealth, which he could now share with his black-skinned citizens, could be taken from him tomorrow. 50% of the whites are against the continuation of the present racist policy. Many others hesitate. fearing the same fate that befell Sudan, Algeria, Egypt, Congo, or Zanzibar.
So they literally list off numerous African countries that following the departure of the colonial empires led to an absolute mess. One country that wasn't mentioned was Zimbabwe, or then Rhodesia. Now look at the state of that country as well. Every single example they had, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, became an absolute hellhole. And it makes me sad that the South Africans at this time, so many were still so naive that they thought if they gave up apartheid, things wouldn't just remain the same, they might get better. And so that is the brief history of the decolonization of sub-Saharan Africa. Again, I'll clarify, I think colonizing Africa was a mistake to begin with. But the bigger mistake was giving it up after Europe had already made its mark on the land. And it's a good case study to show that Europeans can settle completely new environments and tame the land to create spectacular civilizations. And when we look at Zimbabwe or even South Africa, the handover to allow Africa to be ruled by the Africans has been a disaster in so many ways. And I'm not even necessarily blaming the Africans themselves. As I said, they've been dropped the bomb of modern industrial civilization on their heads, and they've had no time to prepare for it. It's not that they don't deserve it, it's just that they're better off without it. And as European countries demographically change more and more, don't be surprised when towns and cities across the continent begin to look more like South Africa now. And in the mid-20th century, this might be a compliment, but now it's a sign of degradation and decline.